From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. Later, many would argue that this heart of our nation is being tested like never before. In 2024, elections are highly fraught and very politicized. A growing number of Americans feel distrust and even outright hostility toward the election system, and too often those who administer it. On a broader scale, we face interference from nations and other bad actors outside the United States. And all of this is occurring against a backdrop of another fiercely contested and momentous presidential election year. I'm delighted to be joined today with my co-authors on this report. David Carroll, who directs the Carter Center's Democracy Program, plays a key role in the center's work to build consensus on international standards for democratic elections. Mark Jones is a Baker Institute's Political Science Fellow, the faculty director of the Rice Master of Global Affairs program, and co-director of the Presidential Elections Program. Kim Wyman is a nationally renowned elections official and former Secretary of State of Washington. She served on the advisory panel for the guiding principles. And Doug Chapin, senior fellow with the Virginia-based research group Force March. He served as lead writer for the guiding principles. Mark, let's start with a pollster's perspective about Americans' thoughts on the current state of democracy and the institutions that support it, particularly the institutions that conduct our election.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for, it's great to be here. I think, when we're thinking about where things are today, it's helpful to go back to where they were in the past. And so if we go back to say 1964, so Jimmy Carter was a first-term Georgia senator. James Baker was a young attorney here in Houston, fresh out of law school. 77% of Americans believe that the federal government, or they trusted the federal government to do what was right just about always or always. That even as late as the early 2000s was hovering a little below 50%. Today, it's at an all-time low, 16%. So that's a pretty dramatic drop in terms of views of the federal government. When we get to things more like politics and elections, if you ask people how do they feel when they're talking about politics and elections, 65% say that they feel exhausted always or often, compared to only 9% who say they feel exhausted rarely. So 65% exhausted, 9% not that exhausted most of the time. And then in terms of anger, 55% feel angry when they're talking about politics always, compared to 11% who feel that way rarely. We flip it around about hopeful. Only 1 in 10 Americans feels hopeful when they talk about politics. 6 in 10 rarely or never feel hopeful. We can even move on to things about how people feel the political system has become. And right now, almost 9 out of 10 Americans believe that the political system today has become much less respectful over the past few years, compared to only 1 in 20 who believe that it's become more respectful. So that's another problem undergirding our system. And we find that most Americans, this is Republicans, Democrats, Independents, 9 out of 10 believe that Republicans and Democrats are far more focused on fighting each other than solving the problems of the American people. And then sort of finally to wrap up, if we ask people how they believe the U.S. political and electoral system is working today, you have 72% who believe that it's either working not too well or not at all well. You have only 4% who believe it's working extremely well. And if you ask about sort of people's confidence in the future of the U.S. political and electoral process and system, we have something pretty similar. We have 64% believe that it's going in they have no confidence or just a little bit of confidence, compared to only 4% who have a lot of confidence. So overall, there's a real malaise in the United States and increasing distrust and dissatisfaction with our political system and our electoral institutions that represents a very serious decline from where it was in the 60s, but also as recently as the start of this century.
So it seems that our elected officials, Mark, would rather blame one another and yell at one another about our problems rather than work together to find solutions. I asked the panel, do any of you have thoughts about the long-term effects of such negativity, and do you think it will continue?
Sure, I'll drop in. I've been in the elections administration space for 30 years and definitely remember the 2000 election and how contentious that felt. And now those feel like the good old days. It's really undermining. I think this polarization that the American public feels is a direct result of things like safe districts, where we have people who are elected that don't feel like they have to ever work across the aisle to get anything done, particularly when they're in a legislative branch or in Congress and have complete control. And so that's where that infighting really, I think, hits home for most Americans, and they start to believe that that Congress or their state legislature is never going to really solve their problems, which I think you heard that in the polling. And now I think post 2020, we're seeing a real impact on people's confidence in American elections, which is why I'm so excited about this work on these principles and how we need to start talking about the importance of our election system and how do we rebuild that confidence in the American public.
Fantastic. David Carroll, the two of us worked for institutes named after former President Carter and former Secretary Baker. And both of them had a great capacity and were known for being able to build consensus when they were in office. 15 years after they came out with their 2005 report of the Commission on Federal Election Reform, our two institutions began a new collaboration that led up to this set of guiding principles. Please tell us how this collaboration came about, and tell us about our goal to discuss hot topics like election administration and other things in a frank yet civil manner.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for this opportunity. I think some of your remarks already gave a bit of the background, but the Carter Center and the Baker Institute have been working together for multiple years now on trying to just put out good information about elections and election practices and challenges, and really drawing on the trusted kind of relationship that President Carter and Secretary Baker developed over a lot of interactions around their work on elections. And really, I think modeling, principled behavior from people who care about elections in this country, knowing that they're on different sides of the political aisle, but that there's a higher importance about just trying to show to the rest of the country that these are very important exercises, and there's some, recognized principles that can guide that. And I think that's the spirit that's behind the work that we're continuing to do between the Carter Center and the Baker Institute.
And David, what was the genesis that led up to these guiding principles?
I mean, our conversations over the past, several years, and realizing that this is something that would be a timely contribution to the current context in the United States, that, bringing together former secretaries of state, other election officials, other election experts, and trying to put out into the public what we see is actually a very solid groundwork for election practices in this country, and making sure that people understand that and knowing how it can still be improved and the importance of making those efforts.
Very good. Doug, you were the lead writer on these guiding principles, and you played a key role in helping us synthesize the goal and what we wanted to do. What's the general purpose of these principles? And why would you and the group think it would be better to come up with guiding principles, overarching principles, rather than strict recommendations?
Well, I think that, and first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I've been working with the Carter Center and the Baker Institute since September of 2005. As that, I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Anyway, on the cover of the report, I really believe that the American election system is a foundational part of our democracy. It is the process by which Americans translate that soup of opinions and ideas into a direction for our government. I'm a big believer in bipartisanship in election administration. And while the numbers that Mark discussed and the current conditions that we see across the country suggest that bipartisanship might be somewhat out of fashion, I really don't think it's dead. And so the goal here was to look for opportunities to identify overarching principles that folks of all points of view could agree upon, or at least agree to move forward on, with regard to election practices in individual states. The reason why they're overarching principles and not specific legislative recommendations is that we all recognize, as we have from the very beginning in this joint effort, that the American election system is somewhat decentralized, that communities seek to structure their own election processes in ways that work for their own mix of urban, rural, suburban voters and other needs at the state or local level. And so while we don't seek to dictate a specific uniform way for communities to run their elections, we do think there are some overarching principles that can undergird improvements or changes in the process that can maybe get us back to more of a bipartisan tack on election administration in this country.
I just would want to add one point going on what Kim said, just an example here from Texas, where we're after our most recent redistricting, we have 38 congressional districts, the second most after California, and we're growing where California is shrinking. Of those 38 in the upcoming election in November of 2024, really only one is competitive. And if you wanted to sort of stretch it out, at most 3, but the other 2 aren't really competitive. So there you have sort of what Kim was saying, that in terms of appealing to a middle of the road voter, swing voter, a non-hyper partisan, we only have one of our 38 members of Congress who really has an incentive to do that.
We took a very concerted effort to avoid hot button issues. I think we recognized that if we came out with something that was one side can complain against or another, it would undo the idea of having a bipartisan approach. That was really one of the reasons we kept away from specific proposals. If you start getting down to the weeds, that provides room for people to start complaining. And we hope that people can use these guiding principles over the next years, and maybe even decades, as they try to work together to come up with specific examples as we need to, because of this type of decentralized nature of U.S. Of elections. As part of that, David, as part of the process of keeping as bipartisan as possible, what was the role of the advisory panel, and why did we feel the need to have one?
One thing that permeates this whole exercise that we've been working on together in our previous collaboration is really trying to show that what people frame as the opposition between access and identity is something that can be really addressed effectively, and that they shouldn't be seen as things that you can only get one of these key goals addressed effectively and not both. And I think Doug Chapin has really helped us, but also the former secretaries of state have played a crucial role. Secretary Wyman and others have really helped us demonstrate through this work that there's not there doesn't have to be an inherent trade-off between those two. You can really make progress on both issues, and I think this document helps to address that.
To open and the question to the panel, is there one principle that you think is overarching, that is even the most important guiding principle here?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think the most important is the one that we've listed first, is that the American election system needs to be a priority. I don't think you can look at the headlines across the nation over the last couple of years and not recognize that the American election system is under threat, and not even like a figurative threat, actually literal threats. We have the women and men who administer our elections getting threats of harm, death threats, fentanyl-laced letters, swatting incidents, what have you. When the election system isn't secure in terms of people feeling secure and participating, then that really hurts its role as a foundational part of our democracy. And so I really believe by making the American election system and the democracy it supports a priority, with protecting voters and election officials, but also regular sources of funding, support for the media and the organized public to protect democracy. I think that itself is a foundational principle which underpins democracy's foundational role. The election system's foundational role in our democracy. So that would be my number one, literally and figuratively.
Of course, Doug took my favorite too. It figures get to go first, and you get to do that. I think second to that one would be number 3, talking about voter registration, and that it should be widely available, easily accomplished, and secure and well run. And really, I think that's the heart of so much of the discussion that comes out of 2020, where you have people who are making these really wild claims and false accusations about this in 2020's case, rampant fraud, and that we had people who were illegally voting and casting ballots. And when in fact, that's probably the biggest chore and challenge that election officials have, is maintaining and keeping voter registration rolls up to date and current. And it's not really, at least in my 30 years experience, it's not so much an issue of whether a person's citizenship is valid, although I think the original Carter Baker report was spot on in we should be providing everyone an ID. And we talked about this in this group and decided to leave that specific reference out. But we really spend a lot of time just trying to keep up with people's moves and making sure that when they move from one county to another or one state to another, we have the most current address and know what districts are eligible to vote in. And I would say 75% of the work that election officials do is just keeping up with moves. And then the secondary issue, of course, is cleaning up people when they have passed away and removing them from the rolls. And all of those things take resources and time. And we need to get that discussion back and away from it's just about making sure only legal people are voting, and talk about how do we have up-to-date modern election rolls that are keeping pace with the lifestyle that Americans have in the 21st century. And I think that principle is really important.
I think number 6 is an important one as well, that states and localities should prioritize policies that allow ballots to be cast and received on or before Election Day, so that the final count can be completed as soon as possible after the election's over. One of the factors that often breeds this uncertainty that's unwarranted completely is when it takes days or sometimes weeks to actually get the final results. In a system where people already have some distrust or some misguided views related to the electoral system, those delays can just foment that distrust and undermine confidence in the actual result. So the more that we can get those absentee ballots and mail ballots counted by Election Day and in by Election Day, or at least close thereto, the better things will be for the overall system.
Doug, you mentioned earlier about the balance between ballot security and the capacity for getting as many people to the polls as possible. That always seems to be like that's the hardest conundrum to square or to resolve when coming up with election rules and regulations. Any thoughts to this group on how these guiding principles might help with that?
One of the things that I think we really are trying to make clear in these principles is that these notions of access and integrity, I think they often are, they're posed as competing, almost as if having more of another. And I think that what we have tried to do throughout this document is demonstrate that it's really possible to do both, that making the system more accessible to voters is not incompatible with improving security, with making sure that the results are accurate and reproducible and trustworthy. And so I think one of the big contributions that I'm hoping this document will make is to maybe put to rest this notion that the ideas of access and integrity are competing notions, but rather twin notions that go together at every step of the election process.
Why is there such a great distrust in election results today? Obviously, we have, frankly, the last two of the last three losing candidates have complained about the outcomes, both one a Democrat and one a Republican, saying that they felt like they didn't get a fair shot. How does that lead to the distrust in elections? And isn't there just a natural tendency for the losing side to complain that we got cheated?
I think it's a couple of things coming to a head. The first thing is we've had decades of political campaigns being able to really motivate their bases and raise a lot of money by creating a lot of discussion around voter fraud and voter suppression. And both sides do it. They do it very effectively, and they really work hard to get their base to believe that the other side is somehow doing something to cheat and advantage their position. And then that morphs into the post-campaign, where when your side loses, it's far easier to say, well, it was a rigged election. Oh, it was the machines, it was the ballot counting, it was the election officials, rather than turning inwardly and saying, what did we not do in the campaign? Where did we fall short? What did the other side do better? And it really started, I think, at the national level in 2016 when Hillary Clinton didn't initially concede the race and then did. Then I think Stacey Abrams in Georgia took it to a new level and kind of gave, quite honestly, the roadmap to President Trump in 2020. And you have these decades of voters being told the other side's cheating. And so it wasn't a stretch for either side's base to believe it. And I think that that's really kind of what we're living with post 2020 is just the manifestation of decades of building up to it. And then many people who make a lot of money peddling these narratives and making people believe that something is wrong and that there was nefarious activity when there in fact was not.
I'm reminded of what President Carter and Secretary Baker wrote once, that not everything Republicans do is voter suppression, and not everything Democrats do is fraud. And so I think you're spot on your answer about there is a little politics intertwined with our perceptions of election results.
Yeah, and John, I add there, I think what Kim says, looking at Hillary Clinton 2016, Stacey Abrams, and then Donald Trump, contrast that with how Al Gore handled his loss, where arguably he had a pretty strong claim that he effectively had a tie. It was just that George W. Bush had the better lawyer and better legal strategy and won. But Gore accepted the results. He didn't effectively try to overturn the Supreme Court ruling, undermine the legitimacy of George W. Bush. He moved on. That type of statesmanship is lacking today.
Same thing with Nixon in 1960.
And John, I'll also point out that, obviously the actions of candidates matter, but we've seen research, the folks at MIT do something called the Survey of Performance in American Elections, and they found that voters who are most confident in the outcome are ones whose candidates have won, with undecided or swing voters, being a little less confident, and fans, if you will, of the losing candidate being the least confident. So it's human nature to be a little bit unhappy about and less confident in a result that didn't go your way. When you layer on that the kind of fierce messaging that we're seeing from candidates on both sides, I think that we've created a situation where it almost feels like any result but a victory for your side is wrong or fraudulent or cheating.
What type of responses do you think these guiding principles will get, and what are you hoping for?
My hope is that we can rekindle a bipartisan discussion eventually in legislatures, but also among advocates and the organized public to bring us back to this notion of bipartisanship and efforts to increase both access and integrity and security throughout the election process. To the extent that we can turn away or tamp down some of the hyper-partisan rhetoric that we've seen in the last several years, I think these guiding principles provide an opportunity to do that, and I hope people take that opportunity.
I hope that these principles become a starting point for the conversation. And I think in probably the last decade or so, it's been very easy to just recede to our partisan camps and yell and scream and not listen to each other, particularly when we're in the minority. It's much easier to yell and scream and throw bombs than it is to actually work together to try to make better policy and make better laws. And I think that these principles hopefully will serve as that conduit to have a starting place. And can't we agree on these core ideas that make our elections strong? And then let's start talking about how we can get there, because I think certainly the people who were around the table working on this idea, we all had very different points of view and very different political and personal life experiences, but the commonality is we're all Americans. And we all need to work together to figure out how to get past this point in our election system where people don't believe the system is valid and solid, and get back to a place where we're talking about how do we make secure and accessible elections so every eligible American can vote. And I think that we can provide that starting point with these.
Kim, I think you nailed it. I want to thank each one of you for joining us today, and thank each of you also for all the work you've done to bring about these guiding principles. We hope it can provide a blueprint for a lot less bickering and a lot more greater collaboration. Thank you so much. Let me close in saying that Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. Audiovisual production is led by Kevin Young. To stay in the loop about new episodes, join our email list at bakerinstitute.org. And once again, thank you for listening. Good day.